On the for side, saying that doctors should be allowed to end a patient's life by some famous means, is Patrick O'Neill. He is a PhD candidate in the Aero Lab at UMBC. He was originally trained in mathematics and philosophy, and he became interested in computational biology, and now applies information theory and machine learning to problems in prokaryotic transcriptional regulation. Please introduce Patrick O'Neill. And on Mr. O'Neill's team is Dr. Simon Stacey. Dr. Simon Stacey is the director of the Honors College at UMBC, and he currently teaches an honors seminar called Ethics and Public Policy. Dr. Stacey focuses primarily on transitional justice and received his PhD in the Department of Politics at Princeton University in 2005 before coming to UMBC. So let's thank Dr. Stacey for being here. On the negative side, we have first Dr. Paul J. Hoehner. He is the Senior Clinical Associate Professor at the Department of Anesthesiology and Critical Care Medicine at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, where Dr. Hoehner received his MD with honors and was awarded the Critical Care Foundation Award. He went on to receive an MA in Theological Studies at the Reformed Theological Seminary, where he was an adjunct professor of practical theology. Dr. Hoehner is now a PhD candidate in theology, ethics, and culture in the Department of Religious Studies in the University of Virginia. Please welcome. And finally, also on the empty side is Father Michael DeAscanis. He is a Roman Catholic priest serving in Baltimore. Before becoming a priest, he received a master's degree in civil engineering from Johns Hopkins University and worked for 4 years as an engineer in a private firm. He then entered seminary and studied for 5 years in Rome, receiving a license in moral theology with a concentration in medical ethics. In addition to other duties, he currently serves as chaplain to a group of medical students at the University of Maryland, and also serves on an ethics committee at St. Joseph Medical Center in Towson. So please welcome Dr.
So, good evening, and thank you all very much. I'd like to begin by thanking you for your attention to Dominic and Rachel BioCOM for organizing these, and especially to Dr. Hoehner and Father DeAscanis for joining us in a collaborative search for the truth. I thank them especially because I'm sure that the best case that can be provided against the permissibility of euthanasia is one that they can do. Right? So I'm glad to have them to help us search for and go through the arguments and the evidence tonight. So this is the, for some reason, the third time that I've been invited before you all to discuss bioethical issues. And I noticed that for most of the issues we've discussed so far, be it, say, GMOs or cloning or animal testing, they affect us all indirectly, if at all. And the question we consider tonight is of a different sort. It concerns how we may die, which is an issue of regrettably universal relevance. All of us will die, and although we do not like to think much about death, our aversion is not reciprocated because death is interested in all of us. No one hopes for a bad death, but it is the case that there are some very, very bad ways to die. And the question we consider tonight is this one. Who will decide for me how I will die? May I choose for myself, or must the state choose for me? It's a difficult subject to explore, and I thank all of you again for your consideration and also for your company in thinking through this. But this issue will not, however, go away if we refuse to think about it. Indeed, as many families have learned too well, my own included, the less thought we give to matters of end-of-life care, the worse they tend to go for us. And so these are best thought through in advance. So tonight we will make a very simple case for the view that you should be in charge of the decision of how you wish to die, right? And not anyone else. Our case is very straightforward, and we're happy to stick out our necks in order to make it easy as possible to identify the source of any disagreement that we may have with the negative team. And our case is as follows. Right? If a capably consenting adult makes a decision concerning their own affairs, we should not intervene without a very, very good reason. That's I think the most controversial argument, the most controversial premise I'll offer you tonight. Okay? All of us are due a strong presumption of personal autonomy in our own lives, and that can be overridden only at a very, very high burden of proof. Okay? That's premise one. Premise two, euthanasia is such a decision. I think that's obvious. Euthanasia is a decision made by a consenting adult about their own affairs. And then thirdly, we will argue together, that there is no such good reason to prevent people from deciding how to die as they wish. Okay? We will invite the negative team to offer the arguments that they have to give us, and we will see together whether they succeed or fail. So this is the question we consider tonight again. If a terminal medical condition robs us of all that we savor in life before it ends our life, who should decide how each of us will die? And we trust that by the end of the evening, the answer will be clear. So thank you again for your attention. I look forward to it.
Again, first of all, I'd like to thank from Father DeAscanis and myself, the organizers of this debate, invitation to participate, and especially for all to come out here on this rainy night and listen to us. And I'm sure that I want to thank our interlocutors here for what I'm sure we're stimulating and productive and hopefully constructive discussion tonight. I'm going to start out with a very provocative statement and say that actually both sides here are for euthanasia, which literally means good death. We all wish our deaths were good. And we all will die, it's been said. And we wish it to be peaceful and expeditious, free of suffering, pain, and isolation. This is assuredly universal. One of my own greatest fears as a physician is dying in a hospital, especially in an intensive care unit. Issues such as these can often be contentious and emotional, but we want to assure you that both sides here share a sincere and conscientious mutual desire to be compassionate, beneficent, respectful of the dignity of suffering persons, particularly at the end of their life. Although we're going to disagree on the meaning of these motives and the moral imperatives attached to these motives, we don't impugn anyone's motives and have much in common in our desires and goals. Indeed, we should commend many of the issues raised by proponents of euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, recognizing how the current renewed interest in this subject is forcing the medical profession to come to grips with its own shortcomings and admitted failings in end-of-life care. I'm responding as someone engaged daily in the heart-rending and mind-challenging realities of death, dying, and suffering as a physician over the past 30 years. My specialty involved pediatric and adult open heart surgery, trauma, and burn. So I'm no stranger to this. As a physician, my heart and prayers go out to the family and friends, especially of Brittany Maynard, whose own decisions become so prominent in the news and really can't help but provide a backdrop for this discussion tonight. We don't condemn her or her family for coming to such a tragic decision and acutely recognize the beneficent motives, love, and care her family and friends express regarding her decision and those that defend the rights of others to make similar decisions. Surely it can be difficult for us to understand how desperate is the desire for relief and how much abandoned a person must feel to reach such an agonizing decision. We will try to show, however, that the beneficence sincerely and compassionately offered her in support of her decision to end her life is unfortunately and tragically both illusory for individuals and ultimately disastrous for healthcare and public policy. As with most controversial issues, and especially in a debate setting such as this, we can be driven by contrived dichotomies of either-or mentality. Rather, we want to advocate a position that avoids what we see as two very problematic extremes. The one extreme is to push for life itself at the expense of a patient's desires, suffering, or comfort. the to-do everything possible mentality that views the patient as a pawn in the sometimes futile war with disease and mortality, that ignores the patient's and family's wishes, and when the limits of medicine is reached, abandons them to intractable suffering, isolation, and abandonment at the end of life, dying with the massive machines and tubes. This is a side of medicine we should all rightly fear. But the other side is to relinquish any hope of a good end when that end is inevitable, and abandoning what is most needed, that is care, meaning, comfort, and relief, dignity, and presence. That is, it does not treat the suffering, but kills the sufferer. And I don't use this word lightly. We cannot substitute euphemism for what we are actually talking about, the direct act of ending an innocent life, even if voluntary and desired. We argue that pain and the fear of pain, suicidal depression, fear of abandonment, and the loss of control are eminently treatable conditions, and that when these conditions are addressed, the need for drastic measures such as assisted suicide disappear. Admittedly and ironically, even though we are able to control pain and symptoms to a greater extent than any other time in history, pain and symptom control in the end stages of life is still underutilized, overly regulated, and healthcare workers are undereducated in this area, and there's many studies to show that. But the rise of aggressive palliative care measures, advances in hospice care, and more focus on patient comfort care rather than cure is turning this around in dramatic ways. Healing encompasses the ideas of coping, caring, assisting the patient in psychological and spiritual healing, and readjusting and restoring and deepening relationships with the community, family, and friends. This kind of healing is a legitimate end of medicine and an ethical obligation which assisted suicide renders impossible. It is, however, something patients have a moral right to expect. Not to make an effort to heal in this deeper sense of the word or to depreciate it is nothing less than moral abandonment of the patient in his or her hour of greatest vulnerability and need. This is what patients and families fear. That fear is often expressed in pleas for the extremes of death or do everything. In a very real way, euthanasia is a flight from compassion, not an expression of it. It should be suspect not because it is too hard, but because it is too easy. We will also argue that euthanasia, far be it from honoring a patient's autonomy or freedom, rather relinquishes that control and autonomy to the physicians and governing authorities. It furthermore has disastrous consequences for the integrity and fiduciary nature of the healing professions, as well as dangerous societal consequences. There is a reason why no major professional physician organizations condone euthanasia or assisted suicide. Euthanasia is not a private decision or act, but one that affects the entire fabric of our communities and its foundational ideals. In arguing these points, we will most likely have incommensurable foundational principles regarding right, wrong, good, or evil. What else is new? If they come up, we will not push a speculative, slippery slope argument. We don't have to.
I believe the judges have called.
Have you called time?
Sorry, here.
I'll sum up with the, okay, I just want to say with our proponents of euthanasia, we share a common dedication to a good death, to ending life well. What we differ in is what we believe constitutes a good death and the meaning that it has for both individuals, caregivers, and society.
Let me add my thanks to Dominic's, to all of you for turning out. I want to thank my colleague on this side of the aisle for helping me out, and my colleagues on the other side of the aisle for helping me out in other ways. And I want to express particularly my appreciation to Dr. Hoehner for bringing up the term euthanasia, which was not actually in the debate topic as it stood, but which obviously stands behind and all around it. It's a Greek word. Its etymology is from the word eu, meaning good, and the word thanatos, meaning roughly death. Right? So euthanasia is a good death, something I think we're all agreed we desire. Our goal is to make sure that the classical etymology of this word is made good on by the promise of its modern practice. Right? Because a good death is often something that cannot be relied upon to come about as a result of natural circumstances. So our charge is to convince you this evening that the modern practice of euthanasia can indeed make good on the promise of its classical origins. So we're charged specifically to show that in cases where patients suffer from incurable disease, doctors should be legally entitled to end painlessly those patients' lives if those patients and their families request this option. So we're charged to make the legal argument for what's philosophically known as voluntary active euthanasia. Right? It's voluntary because the patient is requesting it. It's active because the doctor is involved in bringing about death, which is where the euthanasia element comes from. Right? So let me be clear, we are not in support of any of the, we're not debating any of the other forms of euthanasia that you may have heard of, right? We're not talking about non-voluntary euthanasia, where a patient is, for one reason or other, incapable of either conferring consent or asserting refusal. We're not interested in, we're definitely not interested in defending involuntary euthanasia, where a patient has explicitly refused euthanasia. We like to go on the record very clearly as against that. Just in case any of you are worried. I also want to point out that the motivation that a person might choose euthanasia isn't explicit from the phrasing of the topic, right? But the reason one might choose voluntary active euthanasia is because the incurable disease from which one suffers, it's not the incurability of the disease. The point is the pain associated with the disease or the extent of the diminution of the quality of life that you lead, because the disease itself imposes these things on you, or because the treatment is such that they come about as a result, right? So it's incurability coupled with great unpleasantness, unpleasantness sufficient to cause somebody to believe that their life has ceased to be worth it. Now, when acts are merely or even mostly technical in nature, then it's possible to make decisions about the legalization or criminalization of these acts without really worrying about their moral status. But an issue like voluntary active euthanasia is clearly not an issue like this one. It's a morally weighty one, perhaps the most morally weighty issue we can confront. So we will begin by making the moral case for it and demonstrate not only that it's morally unobjectionable to allow active voluntary euthanasia, but in fact that it's morally desirable. It is a great moral good that this be part of our universe. Having done that, we'll make the case for it as a legal injunction. Our moral case will rest, as the best moral cases do, on widely shared basic assumptions about what kinds of creatures human beings are, about what we're capable of, and about what we're entitled to. In brief, we're creatures which suffer and which die. We are capable, once we become adults, at the very least, and quite possibly before that, we are capable of rationally identifying what things, prospects, opportunities, relationships we value and hold to be worthwhile. And we're capable of deciding what kinds of lives we want to live. And we're entitled to try to live those lives and pursue our objectives, subject, of course, to the condition that we don't unreasonably infringe on the rights of other people to do the same with their lives. It's very, very rarely the case, if it's ever the case, that when we make considered, reflected, well-informed judgments about our own lives and about what we hope for them, that anyone else is going to be better qualified than us to make those judgments. We can make mistakes, of course, and we can choose wrongly for ourselves, but there is no one less likely to choose wrongly for us than we are ourselves.
It's just excellent that we have so many people out tonight to really kind of discuss, as our presenters have already said, basic questions about life and why we're here, and how we exit this life, how we die, what is death, and what control do we or do we not have over it, so what authority do we or do we not have over it. So just this lecture series, this debate series is a wonderful thing. It's great to know that's going on in the state of Maryland. So begin my statement by, as the presenters have already said on both sides, that we seek to help people with a problem, with suffering. Suffering is not a good thing. So the question is how best to help people who are facing suffering. And I dedicate my life, I was a civil engineer, I dedicate my life now as a priest to trying to help people engage spiritual questions, help them in their spiritual life. Dr. Hoehner, he dedicates his life to trying to help people in their struggle with their physical life. And so this is about helping people. This is why we're engaged in this discussion, how best to help people. I have stood by many sick beds, by many deathbeds, as a priest, and And Dr. Hoehner, as a doctor, has stood by many sick beds and many death beds. So that's kind of the whole motivation behind this discussion. And why are we having it in the first place? Again, it's common goal, common intention. How best to help people. We live in a society where we know with modern medicine, life expectancy is increased. And with modern medicine, our life can be prolonged even when we're seriously sick. And in that process, we can face great uncertainty, great fear, great possibility of suffering and pain. And so how best to address it? I always say as a moral theologian, when we have problems in life, we have to say, okay, what are we going to do with this problem? How are we going to solve it? There are good solutions and there are bad solutions. And good intentioned people discuss and they can arrive at different results. But there are good solutions and there are bad solutions to problems. And that's the debate tonight. What is the right solution to the problem of suffering? Current law in the majority of the United States and the majority of the world is that people do not have the permission to take their own life or have someone assist them in taking their own life. Now, you don't really need permission to take your own life, right? If you take it, you can't be prosecuted for having taken it. But the law generally recognizes around the world that taking your own life is not a good thing, and the law generally prohibits helping someone else take their own life. So in this debate, we are kind of anti-euthanasia, but we are pro the law. We are pro the common situation. Euthanasia is the exception. Now, obviously, some states have legalized it in some countries. It's a minority. Obviously, there's a big discussion, and there may be a growing public opinion in favor of it. But what we are proposing is simply what society has proposed in the majority of the world for the majority of history. So, basic principle, there are good solutions and bad solutions. We try to stay in the middle. We permit death. Death is going to occur, but we refuse to be the cause of death. That's a basic principle. We permit it, but we refuse to be the cause. And so in that, in a sense, we're in the middle, because on one side, there are those who will try to avoid death at all costs. We don't make that argument. And there are those on the other side who say, let's take control over death and cause it. And we don't agree with that position. We say it's coming, we can permit it, we can prepare for it, but we refuse to be the cause of it. So, what is the solution we propose? Treat the suffering, don't kill the sufferer. Aggressive palliative care, which we will discuss in more detail. That's what we propose. Palliative care, treat the suffering. And then finally, why is assisted euthanasia, assisted suicide, why is that harmful? We're going to develop 3 points. There are destructive consequences. It's destructive for the person involved, it's destructive for the medical profession, and it's destructive for society.
Thank you for the opening remarks. We will now move into the construction. Each side will have 9 minutes, however they wish to split it amongst themselves. The judges will be keeping time again, I believe, and giving 5 to 1 minutes. So when the affirmative team is ready, they begin.
So thank you again. So I want to begin by reminding everyone of the terrain of the debate, at least as we see it. This is the framework for the debates that we propose, because the subject that we discuss is one in which there is a broad latitude of private opinion about the relative merits of decisions that we might make about the end of life. And so I want to remind everyone involved of the 3 premises that we propose, right? Which is that, firstly, that euthanasia is a decision that consenting adults make for themselves, right? And you need a very, very good reason to intervene in decisions that you make, right? And I think that this clarifies a bit of the difference between the affirmative and the negative. I think the negative raises many issues worth considering, some of which I agree with. But the issue, as far as I've heard so far, seem to cut across this point. That is, they don't address the issue that there's a presumption of personal autonomy. That is, to a very good first approximation, individuals are the best judges of what is best for them. Right? And so the burden of proof lies with them. Though the law may currently criminalize euthanasia and even physician-assisted suicide, right? There is a moral presumption, right, that if you want to interfere with how an individual chooses to deal with a terminal illness, the burden is on you to show why their own judgment cannot be trusted. This is premise number one. Secondly, as I said before in the opening, euthanasia is obviously just one such case. Right? It's a decision made by a consenting adult that harms no one else, and we can discuss in more detail what exactly we mean by consenting and why exactly I say that it harms no one else in a meaningful way. But of course, that's I think the thrust of that premise is uncontroversial. And the third premise is really, I think, the meat of the argument. That is, are there any very, very good reasons to prevent individuals from doing as they wish with their own lives? Right? And so I want to make two claims. Right? The first claim is that there are no such good reasons, and the second claim is that euthanasia may sometimes be a reasonable option for an individual to take. I hope that for no one in this room, none of us are faced with a decision, but statistically, some of us will be faced with such a decision. And I argue that though we decline to think much about it to be public, right, that might be, for some individuals, the best option available to them. And so why? I want to begin by anticipating some of the arguments that could be raised against the permissibility of euthanasia. So Dr. Hoehner declined to discuss a slippery slope in this debate tonight. But to be honest, I'm not arguing in order to win the debate. I'm arguing to convince you all that if there is, for example, an election in the state of Maryland that will decide whether individuals can, with their physicians, end their own lives as they see fit, that we will have the best arguments and evidence available to us. And so, opponents of euthanasia often argue that if euthanasia is decriminalized or legalized, then we will see an expansion of the conditions in which it is applied. And if this argument seems compelling to you, I want to ask you, well, if you admit that, right, doesn't that mean that there are cases in which euthanasia is a morally legitimate course of action? And on the other hand, right, if you think that euthanasia will lead to a general expansion of conditions under which it's applied, that is, perhaps you fear that it may be applied to patients with non-terminal illnesses may also be legally cleared to end their own lives. I would ask again, right, who is the best judge in that case as well? A second argument that I think is often given by those who wish to see euthanasia remain criminalized is that patients who are facing this decision might feel a burden from their families. That is, for some reason, their consent might not be truly genuine. I think it is important to obtain genuine consent, absolutely. And we're not arguing that euthanasia should be legal for patients who are unable to give consent or to refuse. But we ask of the negative and all of you, what is so special about the case of euthanasia? There are a vast array of life-changing decisions that we make, whether to get married, whether to join the military, etc. And we definitely seek out consent in those cases, right? But we don't ask, right? Well, do you really mean it, right? We take individuals at their word, and so if you want to claim that individuals cannot consent to euthanasia, I would ask you, what else can they not consent to? So I want to reserve the rest of my time and let my colleagues have to say a few words from the case. Again.
Thank you, Patrick. I want to build on the case Patrick has made about the importance of autonomy, but to lay out a somewhat crisper and tighter argument for euthanasia. As you'll see, this is an argument that progresses through the defensibility of suicide to the defensibility of assisted suicide, and ultimately to the defensibility of voluntary active euthanasia. And it depends, as you would expect, on the kinds of claims made earlier about the sorts of creatures that we are, and specifically that we're capable of determining our own interests, indeed, that nobody is more capable than us of doing that, are capable of deciding how to pursue them, and subject to the proviso that we not violate the rights of others. So, here's the first point. If an incurable disease is causing a person unbearable pain, or has so reduced the quality of life of that person, or if the treatment required by such a disease has had those consequences, that person's continued existence may not be in her interest. Right? Somebody's life may cease to be worth living if it is a life filled with pain, or so characterized by the absence of pleasure that it no longer appeals as an object. In such circumstances, suicide would be a rational action. And it's worth noting that since the 1980s, 30 states have decriminalized suicide in America. And in the 1990s, all but 2 had done so. But a suicide under these conditions is so far just rational. To establish that it's moral, we need to go a little further. And I would suggest that a suicide in such circumstances is moral if, in addition to being in the interests of the person committing suicide, it neither violates anyone else's rights, nor does anyone else any wrong. Now, there are certainly some circumstances in which wrong might be done, right? One can imagine children left parentless by the suicide of their parents. But one can just as easily imagine circumstances in which no such wrongs would occur. And those are the cases I invite you to consider. An action that neither violates someone else's rights, nor does anyone any wrong, and that is not contrary to one's own interest in, cannot be wrong. It cannot be morally wrong. So committing suicide, in the case of the patient described above, cannot be morally wrong. And this, at least in this case, moral rightness is a transitive property. So assisting somebody to commit suicide, where they are themselves entitled to commit suicide, cannot be morally wrong. And, continuing the argument of transitivity, if it's not wrong to assist someone to commit suicide, where they're entitled to, it can't be wrong to voluntarily euthanize somebody where they were originally entitled to commit suicide in the first place. This seems to me to be a pretty natural argument and to rest on fairly modest and pretty robust presumptions. There are objections one might imagine to them, and I'm sure we'll come to them. But at this point, I don't think we have much more to do to establish the legal permissibility of euthanasia. Right? If it's morally permissible, what would it take for it now to be legally permissible? And in this case, I think, not always the case, but in this case, the law and morality track one another, right? So our challenge is minimal. There is a presumption, it's a rebuttable one, certainly, that a morally permissible act should not be taken. Law and morality should track one another, in other words. So I would suggest that once you've established that voluntary active euthanasia is morally permissible, the obligation lies with the negative side to demonstrate the objections that would render it legally impermissible.
All right, thank you for, and I really appreciate the clarifying of some of the issues, because those are just exactly the issues that we are going to need to address. The foresight here it has stated really that the conditions to legalize this, one is voluntary, that it's intractable pain coupled with an incurable illness that sets the foundation for its moral licitness. That coupled with a curious statement that states have decriminalized suicide, I'm going to come back to later because it's an interesting comment that seems foundational for the progression of logic that is not true. First of all, I'm going to address the incurable suffering, because if the suffering itself is something that can be taken care of, why is there need and an overriding need to allow for euthanasia? basically, pain is a huge problem in end-of-life care. Several studies have shown that we have really inadequate levels of pain control in an era and in a time when we project that basically 99% to 100% of patients can be controlled, can have their symptoms and pain controlled at the end of life. Even if we were to assume that there are rare cases of truly untreatable pain and suffering, and we will include intractable symptoms of this would not be a sufficient reason to justify moral approbation or legal sanction of euthanasia and assisted suicide. To do so would commit the fallacy of composition, that is to attribute to the whole the characteristics of one of its parts. There are several barriers that are present that need to be addressed first before we just hunt to physician-assisted suicide. There's a tremendous knowledge barrier. Peer-reviewed studies have shown that physicians consistently undertreat their patients. They don't know what combination of drugs to use. They fear using too much. There are legal restrictions that are feared, and et cetera. And as an anesthesiologist, whose specialty is pain, I know this firsthand. There are also legal barriers, state regulations that regulate how we dispense these things in situations that have no bearing. It's to set up a straw man and tell a patient he has two choices, either PAS, assisted suicide, or a good chance of dying in agony. The choice is not true. We have the ability to take care of pain, but most patients do not request assisted suicide or depression or euthanasia for pain, but rather for depression. And this is a grossly underdiagnosed and undertreated aspect of end-of-life care. Far, far greater than pain. Paul McHugh, who's a former professor of psychiatry and neuroscience at Johns Hopkins Hospital and at the School of Medicine, says that with physical diseases, suicide or depression is one of the condition's characteristic features. And this is not a situational depression based on circumstances, it's symptomatic. It is not a natural feeling of discouragement but at circumstances, but it actually accompanies terminal illnesses and terminal news, much like an increased heart rate or pulse or fever or anything else like that is a symptom. It beclouds judgment. It provides a sense of misery and hopelessness, suicidal inclinations, and delusional belief that these patients are useless, burdensome, or even perpetrators of evil. This is not a proper assessment of their situations. It is eminently treatable. It is a condition. But this condition is one of the reasons why we say that in the vast majority, if not all these conditions, it is not a voluntary decision until these aspects are treated. It also decouples really the incurable pain issue or from the disease itself that is the foundation for the euthanasia. To agree with a patient that his life is worth ending in these situations is a form of collusion with a psychiatric illness, according to Paul McHugh. It is akin to treating anemia with bloodletting. Finally, I would just want to say that there are consequences that do go beyond individual patient decisions. This is not a private decision. This is not an individual. It will fundamentally change the way in which physicians and their calling and the internal morality of medicine, those which have always been inherent in medical care. I'm going to let you take it from there. And
we're doing tag team on our construction. So, as we said, we're trying to demonstrate that assisted suicide is destructive to the person, to the medical profession, and to society. So we're focusing on the person and looking at what would lead one down that road. What are the arguments for doing it? This fear of pain, the fact that the sense of helplessness, that depression sets in, and also the loss of dignity, which was mentioned, the fear of losing the quality of life. But it's destructive of the person, obviously, because once you kill yourself, in a sense, your bodily life is destroyed. So that's kind of obvious, but the question is it a better good to end the suffering than to end than to maintain the life, right? Because death is going to come at some point. Someone said, though, when you look at suicide, you only get one chance here on earth. You only live one life. So when you end it, it's over. Now, life's not an ultimate value, and as Christians, those who might be Christian, we have a very clear sense of what's on the other side, and we look forward to it. So we're not saying that it's an absolute value, but we are saying you only get one chance. So suck the marrow out of life, right? There is a lot that you experience about human nature and life through suffering, through pain, right? If life was all happiness, you wouldn't really be, it wouldn't be realistic, right? You wouldn't understand the value that comes through struggle, through effort, through sacrifice, right? So there's a value to infancy, there's a value to adulthood, there's a value to being older, there's a value even to the dying process. You learn things about yourself, you learn things about others through that dying process, right? So the fear of loss of dignity. I don't want to die because I don't want to be dependent. I don't want to have someone to have to feed me. I don't want someone to have to change me. I don't want someone to have to bathe me. That's undignified. Well, really? Is it undignified when we do that for our babies? We feed them, we wash them, we change them. And isn't that beautiful? Isn't that an act of love? Doesn't it make you a better person for doing it? And so our parents did it for us, and then most of us are going to be called to do it in some way for our parents. Does that mean that they're less dignified or have no quality of life? There was a young man, he was a seminarian actually. He was in the U.S. Navy. He was diagnosed with brain cancer. Philip Johnson, he wrote a response to Brittany. He said, "Don't do it, Brittany. I understand. I'm going through the same struggles and fears." But he said, "You know what? They told me I had 18 months to live. So I left the Navy and I applied to seminary." Now, I don't know who accepted him in the seminary when he had a prognosis of 18 months to live. 6 years later, he's still alive. But he said, "In this process of sickness, I have gotten to know my family and those who care for me. We have said things to each other that we would never otherwise say." It's a part of life. It can be tough, but it's a part of the human experience. You only lose your dignity if you give it up yourself. Dignity can't be taken away from you. You only lose it if you give it up.
So both teams will have 3 minutes now to prepare their rebuttals. The judges will again tell us when that time has expired, and then each team can split however they like their full 8 minutes of rebuttal.
Other than an increase, people would be inclined to seek euthanasia. So palliative care, as aggressive as it needs to be, that leads people to think their lives will be bearable, is certainly something we can all get behind, right? But to believe that there are no cases in which pain will not be so great as to be unendurable, or to believe that there are no cases in which the effects accompanying treatment are so egregiously horrible as to lead to that conclusion, is simply to be willfully neglectful of an irrefutable historical record. One cannot read the testimony of persons who have chosen euthanasia after careful and deliberate thinking about the subject and not heroic endeavor. The second small point I'd like to make is this. To think that it is no loss of dignity to be treated at the end of one's life as one was treated at the beginning of one's life seems to me to be a mistake. I, for one, would feel precisely infantilized if I had to be taken care of as an adult, as I had been taken care of as an infant. But the real point I want to make is this one, and I must confess that I will be putting some words in the mouth of the opposition, but I think I'm entitled to do so. Well, let me say I have grounds for so doing. I have a couple of things I wanted to point out. Father DeAscanis used these very words. We will permit death, but refuse to be the cause of it, right? So we will permit death, but refuse to be the cause of it. Dr. Hoehner claimed that he was not committed to the view that treatment should continue up until the very end, right? Presumably then, there will be some point at which a withdrawal of treatment will be countenanced because the continuation of it no longer makes any sense, right? The kind of life being lived by the patient being treated is no longer worth the treatment being imposed, right? I think that the conjunction of those 2 points leaves us on a terrain that's actually quite familiar in the debate about euthanasia. That's the difference between killing and letting die. Right? And it sounds to me like the opposition is prepared to concede that letting die is morally acceptable. I think this is entailed by the fact that they are willing, right, to permit death first, and secondly, willing not to treat up until the bitter end. I really don't see any way of understanding the conjunction of those 2 points, except by understanding them as a willingness to withdraw treatment when the time comes, right? The point I'd like to make is this, though. I'm not sure that in this case anyway, there is a distinction to be made between killing and letting die. Let me give you an example, right? Jones and Smith are two unscrupulous characters, right? Both of whom stand to profit from the deaths of their 6-year-old nephews, right? If Jones and Smith's 6-year-old nephews die, they'll inherit a great sum of money. Now, Jones one evening goes into the bathroom and puts his nephew's young head under the water and waits until he stops stroking. Right? That's an instance of killing. Jones, was it Jones or Smith first? The other one. The other one goes into the bathroom as his nephew is about to get into the bath and witnesses the nephew slip, hit his head, and slide beneath the water. Now, this character is quite prepared to put out his hand, should he need to, and push the nephew's head back under if he recovers. But it turns out that he doesn't need to, right? The kid comes underwater. Are you inclined at all to think that one of these is less culpable than the other, right? We have here a case of killing and a case of letting die. But I would be surprised if your intuitions lead you to think that there's any difference in culpability between these two situations, right? If that's the case, if we are prepared, if we are unwilling to make that discrimination, then a commitment to letting patients die cannot be distinguished from a commitment to killing patients. All this, of course, assumes that we're talking about voluntary active euthanasia. So no patients who wish not to die are being killed in this scenario, right? But any patient who expresses that wish ends up in the same place, whether they are killed or let die, and it's difficult to see how the actions performed by the people letting die or killing are possibly discriminatable. One more point. If you want to retain the idea that there's a difference between killing and letting die, and you want to think that killing is somehow more serious than letting die, that's probably because you think there is a wrong-making factor associated with killing that is greater than the wrong-making factor associated with letting die, right? For some reason, you're inclined to believe that there's less wrong going on in the one case than the other. The only reason we think there's any wrong going on at all is because the interests of the people dying are being frustrated when we think it's wrong to kill or let die, right? But in the case of voluntary active euthanasia, it is the interests of the patient that they die, right? And so what that does is reverses the situation. What had been the wrong-making factor and the greater wrong-making factor in the case of killing becomes a greater right-making factor. Let me try one more time. If you think that it is wrong-er to kill than to let die, when that is something that a patient doesn't want to happen, it is correspondingly right-er, right, to kill a patient than to let a patient die, when that is what a patient wants to happen, right? I'm not disputing that killing and letting die in the ordinary case of affairs are both wrong. But when it is the outcome sought, when death is the outcome sought, the more active route, the route that more actively pursues the envisioned goal of the patient, is in fact the more laudable one.
So, thanks for your remarks. In the time we have left, I want to get back to my friends on the team about the rest of the arguments. We've seen a lot of arguments tonight, and I want to again try to clarify the ground and see what has been shown and what hasn't. So the negative team began by saying that both sides want good deaths, but I insist that this is not the case as far as I understand. There is one side on the debate that wants to let people act in accordance with their own persistent, urgently expressed preferences, and the other side does not, right? And it's on, again, it's the burden of the team to show why they should choose for us. Unfortunately, so they mentioned at the beginning of an argument that could serve this, and they say that this affects all of us, right? But they need to explain how. Okay, If you want to criminalize euthanasia, you need to explain what is the very good reason that allows it to override the preferences of individuals. Right? They say that we disagree about what constitutes a good death. Our response is that we don't have to. We do not have to agree. Right? We have to agree on the conditions under which individuals can choose themselves, or why they should not be allowed to choose themselves. And I know there are severe constraints on time, and perhaps they haven't gotten to it yet. But we need to hear from the negative why they're allowed to choose for us. So they have mentioned that euthanasia in many jurisdictions is currently illegal, right? But we can all think of other things that have been illegal, which we, of course, later decriminalize for good reasons. Right? So that it's possible to treat aggressive conditions with palliative care. Would that it were so? I agree with Dr. Hoehner that we should review regulations for pain medicine and liberalize them. But of course, you cannot treat Alzheimer's. Right? You cannot undo the damage that it does to an individual's personality. There is no amount of morphine that will allow an individual with advanced Alzheimer's to live thinking. So, thank you for your time. I apologize to the opposition for not addressing all of their concerns, but hope we'll be able to get into it in the Q&A and the back and forth. So, thank you.
First, I want to address it. Yes, we do think there is a valid moral distinction between killing and letting die. The analogy that was given comes from a philosopher, James Rachel's, about the nephew in the bathtub analogy. I agree with him. There is no moral difference in that analogy between letting someone die and killing. The fallacy there is what I call the sledgehammer. And that is an analogy that so destroys the nuances of the situation as to make it irrational. It's like pouring, lemon juice in 2 glasses of wine. You can no longer tell the difference anymore. It destroys it. What's missing from that argument? What's missing is the motive of the both moral actors in that situation. Both wanted that patient dead. Both had illicit moral motives that were just played out in 2 different directions. In the utilitarian calculus, which in our modern society, we have no room for motive, but we all know that that is an essential part of any kind of moral act. And we have, especially in the Catholic tradition and the Western tradition, we have a great history of using that, and we use it today in terms of double effect in medicine every day as we weigh risks and balances of possibly doing harm to patients, but we look at the motives behind what we are doing. And you can ask me more about that a little later. The basis of our argument is one that allowing physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia is harmful to the patient, it's harmful to the medical profession, and it's harmful to society. First of all, it is I'm going to concentrate right now on making the case that it is a distortion of the healing relationship. The purpose of medicine has always been to restore health when it's possible and enable the patient to cope with disability and death when it's not. And that is going to be undermined by this. The fundamental relationship of the doctor-patient is irreducibly grounded in trust. It is a fiduciary or covenant arrangement. It is fundamentally important for the patient to trust that the physician will always act in an attempt to heal and not to consider even the possibility of removing the need to heal by killing. Now let's make no doubt, when a patient is requesting it, there is ample evidence that that request cannot be seen as an autonomous choice in the situations that those patients are requesting it. To legalize physician-assisted suicide, and it always is going to have to be assisted, it always is going to be dependent on others to help, is going to come into this situation. How can patients trust that the doctor will pursue every effective and beneficent measure when he or she can relieve herself of a difficult or challenge by influencing the patient to choose death? There is a very strong, as much as we put barriers in between, what we call the Asclepian force of physicians to influence patients. Laws against this protect patients from that. assisted suicide is known to be a viable option at the outset, it cannot fail to influence the patient, the physician, and everyone else involved in the patient's care. It is not a private decision. If it is not known at the outset, the patient is deprived of the clues needed to interpret the patient's actions. This is more than amplified by increasing concerns over the costs of medical care, the progressive involvement of impersonal healthcare networks serving as surrogates of the federal government, and this will be especially true in terms of how we treat and see the elderly. Once the line is crossed, once the principle is accepted juridically, medically, socially, innocent life can and will be destroyed for whatever reason. Those aren't my words, those are words of Walter Percy. And Albert Schweitzer said, if a man loses reverence for any part of life, he will lose reverence for all of life. The line is drawn for a reason. To remove that line removes all ability to draw lines anywhere else.
Just to rebut a couple other points. One was saying, why are we choosing for someone else? Why are we imposing a choice upon them and not letting them choose for themselves? We're not choosing for them, but we are saying that society generally recognizes that some choices should be off the table. Now, as individuals, we can make any choice we want, right? You can call suicide legal or illegal, but ultimately it doesn't matter if you take your life. You're not going to be prosecuted for it. This is a question about what is good for society. So you can say, if you get in an argument with your friend, there are good solutions and there are bad solutions, right? We're just saying some solutions are off the table. Like, don't go out and buy a gun and shoot them, right? You don't generally think you're going to do that, right? It doesn't usually enter in the equation because you've taken it off the table. We're just saying, let's take suicide off the table, right? We've always had it in society, we always will, but let's not encourage it. Let's say there are better solutions. So we're not making the choice, we're just saying, generally society says some choices better kept off the table. Secondly, this is about autonomy. As the doctor said, it's not ultimately, there's an element of autonomy that each of us, we each are going to have to make decisions for our lives. But we also realize we have rights, but we have responsibilities. Our choices affect others. These aren't choices in isolation. Brittany Maynard had to make a choice, right? It affected her husband, it affected her family. It was a big national discussion. And so it affects society. We said it's destructive to the person, it's destructive to the medical profession, it's destructive to society. How so? Well, as the doctor also said, it's a fundamental decision point. Of course we can take a vote and say society has a right and a power to choose to let certain people take their lives or to kill other people. Of course we have the opportunity to do that, but we haven't done it. We're increasingly uncomfortable with choosing to take other people's lives. We just outlawed capital punishment in the state of Maryland. That's a victory. That's a good thing. Even people who have broken the law with the consequence of capital punishment, we're saying, we don't even want to kill them because you know what? This is too big. This is too big for us. Maybe they're going to change their lives. Maybe we don't have quite the right judgment, right? We're uncomfortable with making a decision over life and death. If we as a society say we're going to put that decision now into human hands, individuals, but this isn't about suicide, this is about assisted suicide, this is about drawing others into the equation, even the medical profession. And if the person chooses it, but then they're no longer able to make the decision because now they're in a coma or unconscious and can't say, yeah, do it now, someone else has to make the decision. So it's saying, do we want to make this fundamental turning point in society to say we're going to put the decision over life and death now into human hands? But the choice affects others. We have rights, but we have responsibilities. If you're a parent, you have responsibilities to your children. Do you have a right to say, I'm just not going to work anymore? If everyone in this room said, we're just not going to work anymore, would that affect other people? It certainly would. We have a certain autonomy, but our choices affect others. It's destructive to society. Thank you.
So we will now enter the 10-minute cross-examination. Would one of the judges like to explain how that would work?
So the cross-examination is relatively simple. It's going to be 10 minutes of back and forth from both sides, doing just a mini Q&A to ask the other side what points might have gone interest in the argument, or if they need clarification, whatever it may be. So since the affirmative started off the constructive, we'll let the negative have the first question.
Well, one of the questions we have, and it seems to be the basis of choosing it, this avenue, is that voluntary euthanasia, and I'm glad you made the distinction between non-voluntary and involuntary, and don't want to go that way, because those are areas that are we see as naturally reprehensible. But what are the safeguards that voluntary euthanasia will not end up in involuntary euthanasia? If autonomy is the basis for that kind of decision-making, it seems to be a universal right that we can make those decisions. And why do we just limit that to people who can make decisions? Why do we neglect the comatose patient who may not want to be suffering, the child who is suffering intractably but can't make that decision, the elderly Alzheimer patient who can't make that decision? What are the safeguards, if any, that move from voluntary to involuntary? Especially when we have a laboratory of that in Europe that has explicitly shown that even good safeguards can't prevent that kind of process.
Thanks for the question. I think the first point I would make is that I'm not really sure that the empirical evidence suggests that there is this slippery slope that you described. So voluntary euthanasia has been legal in the Netherlands for quite some time. Between 1990 and 1995, the rate of involuntary euthanasia in the Netherlands declined from 0.87% of deaths to 0.8% of deaths to 0.7% of deaths, right? In 1995, in Australia, which does not have similar legislation regarding voluntary euthanasia, the rate of involuntary euthanasia was 3.5%, 5 times the size of the rate in the Netherlands, right? So it actually seems to be the case that in countries which have voluntary active euthanasia, the rate at which involuntary euthanasia occurs is lower than the rate at which it happens in countries that do not have voluntary active euthanasia. So I think the jury is more than out on this question, but to the extent that it's rendered a verdict at all, it's rendered a verdict that is supportive of our case. The second point I would make is that I think that it is really easy to secure the border between voluntary active euthanasia and involuntary euthanasia. The issue is consent, right? If somebody is incapable of consenting, then euthanasia in the case of that person is simply not an option. It's simply off the table, right? I'm not sure that that should necessarily be the case. There is an argument to be had about instances in which patients are brain dead or in persistent vegetative states, perhaps, so incapable of leading what resemble normal human lives that it would perhaps be better if euthanasia were an option in those cases. But I really do not think that there is any difficulty in distinguishing the cases.
Which is exactly the point that I would make. Once we make that fundamental step and we hand over and put it into the hands of a human person to decide when do you die and when do you don't, then someone's got to make the decision. Who decides when it's a handicapped person? Who decides when it's comatose? Who decides when it's an infant who's handicapped, which is permitted by law in Holland that infant children with disabilities can be euthanized. So all of a sudden as a society, we made a fundamental turn. Now somebody has to make these decisions. And that is not where society wants to go. We could. Holland has. Some states have.
And I want to refute the statistics there. Data from the Rutland Committee in 1995 shows that there was a decrease in what they called assisted suicide without consent. But the problem with those statistics is that the actual number of patients went up with that, from 2,000 to 2,400. The official data says it's about a 1% slip up. If I had a 1% slip up in my practice in anesthesiology, it would be horrific. If we had a 1% slip up in the rate of perfect landings in an airline, I don't think we would accept that. Furthermore, what this data does not include is death by opiate administration in that, which is roughly 80% of that is without the patient's explicit consent, according to this report. In that case, the number of PAS accountable patients that were euthanized without appropriate consent actually went up considerably in the Netherlands. So it's how, yes, there's statisticians and liars, and usually they're the same bunch, and you can't put any kind of spin in one of these numbers. But from our aspect, it's not that encouraging to see how this is played out. So I'm going to just caution on those numbers, but we'll let you.
Well, I think it would be surprising if the legalization of an option didn't result in the increased use of that option, right? When you have extra options, it is precisely expected that some of those options will be taken advantage of, right? If you had the option to drive at 85 miles an hour instead of 75 miles an hour, you'd probably do it, right? Now, whether or not it's a good thing or a bad thing to drive at 75 versus 85 miles an hour is a separate question. What we have sought to demonstrate is that driving at 85 miles an hour, in other words, having the option of voluntary active euthanasia, is indeed a good thing. And if that's the case, why would you expect anything other than an increase in the utilization of that option? Extra options are always going to change people's decision structures, especially when the options are, as we've argued, good ones.
I also want to propose, though, once it becomes an option, it quickly becomes an expectation and a burden. If you know as an elderly person that now your family is supporting you and they're taking time out to go visit you and they're paying for some of your care, and your neighbor just ended their life, well, Mom, why don't you? How many people have I seen in my work who don't want to be a burden on their children, which is an altruistic instinct for parents because they give their life to their children. They love their children. They serve them. I say, look, you took care of the children. They have a responsibility to take care of you. Don't feel guilty. But once it becomes an opportunity, a right, a practice that some people are ending their lives under certain circumstances, then all of a sudden you become selfish for not to. So of course the number is going to increase for different reasons in different directions. It's inevitable. It's not a slippery slope. It's saying once it becomes practice, it's in society. Once you put the decision into human hands, it's in human hands. And then what about the person who chose it but now isn't in a position that they can make a decision? When is the decision? Someone has to decide the place, the time, the circumstances. So, but I also, we speak of the slippery slope, but we kind of want to rebut that too. It's not that it could happen, it already has happened. Once you take the step has been taken. It goes in different directions. It went in directions in Holland. It's well beyond one person saying, I would like to end my life now, please help me. There are numerous circumstances in which it now can be legally used. So once you say it's in human hands, then humans are going to decide how to employ it.
I have two questions for the audience. First, doctor, how do you pronounce your last name? Because
Hoehner.
Hainer. Yeah, sorry about misnaming you earlier. Thanks. But a more substantive question. I think so. I'm glad to hear you introduce the Remley report and to begin to start thinking about the social consequences of euthanasia, because to me that is the most compelling argument that the negative side has to offer. So we have some evidence about how things go when euthanasia is legalized. And if it turns out that things just go to hell when you allow physicians to help patients end their lives, that would be, to me, a convincing reason not to legalize it. Right? So I want to ask you, is that for your side what the debate is truly about? That is, if it is the case that things did not go to hell in the Netherlands, that euthanasia, the practice of euthanasia, has proceeded for roughly 30 years, as it was expected to by its proponents. Is that is that your true rejection? That is that for you what the debate is really about, or is it about something else?
No, our objection is that the act of taking an innocent life is not warranted morally in these situations. Like I said, we don't have to make a slippery slope argument to show that legalizing this is harmful to patients, harmful to society, and harmful to the medical profession. But what it does, what we did say is, once you open that gate, once you withdraw that line, the society for centuries has held, and all of a sudden we think we can do away with it now, that we have to understand that there are going to be consequences to that as well. So we are both moral essentialists and consequentialists in our view of this. So that's my answer, no. We are not dependent on slippery slope.
That's fine for the cross-examination.
So we had